Hi! Recently I played some computer games and I also rediscovered the old game I've played a lot back then. Perhaps you know it, it was called the Incredible Machine. And the goal of the Incredible Machine was to trigger a side effect. At least I would explain it this way nowadays, being a software developer. For instance, here we have a side effect because the bowling ball is falling down. It will trigger this cannon and the cannon will trigger additional stuff. But please have a look by yourself. You see it is falling down, the cannon is triggered, and so on and so forth. So this game was really a lot of fun. But honestly, if your software architecture looks like this, you really have an issue. Because in this case, you cannot easily change a thing anymore. Changing something here makes breaking something there. And this is a software that is really not maintainable. To prevent such situations, you can use ideas from domain-driven design, which is perhaps the only methodology bridging the gap between your requirements and your software architecture or your coarse-grained application design. If you look more closely to domain-driven design, you see two disciplines. One is called strategic design, the other one is called tactical design. Strategic design is more about decomposing a big system into tiny parts, while tactical design is more about design patterns and practices. Patterns like factories, like repositories, and so on. As you see here, strategic design it is more about architecture, because architecture is all about decomposing a big chunk into tiny parts, and so for the time being I will stick with this very aspect of DDD. In this talk I will show you how to create sustainable architectures with ideas from domain-driven design. And here two terms are very important for me. The first term is sustainable. It is not about doing something in a quick and dirty way, no, it is about investing a bit upfront to have a software that can be maintained for years or decades. And it's about ideas, because for me DDD is not a religion. For me it is a nice toolbox and it really has some tools that do a good job for achieving this very goal. But now let me tell you about the contents of this presentation. I will tell you two things. First of all, I will show you what strategic design is about. I will give you an overview, and then I want to show you how to implement this idea with domain-driven design and with monorepos. But first of all, let me introduce myself. I am Manfred, I am a trainer and consultant, and I'm focusing on Angular. I'm doing a lot of remote trainings and workshops nowadays, and when there is not a pandemic, I'm also doing a lot of stuff in-house. Besides this, I'm quite connected to the Angular community. I live in Austria, I'm doing a lot of stuff in Germany, and I'm always happy if I can visit other countries. So let's get started with the first chapter I've prepared. It's about strategic design. So the main idea of strategic design is not to write a monolith that can do everything, like booking a flight, like boarding passengers, like checking in passengers, and so on. No. Instead of this big chunk of application, strategic design tells you to create tiny subdomains, like a booking domain in our case, a check-in domain, a boarding domain, or a luggage domain. And now you should try to isolate your subdomains. The less they know about each other, the better it is. Because in this case, you can change one side without affecting another part of the application. When you have found out about your domains, you should put them into a context map. This context map also shows you which domain needs to communicate with which other domains. In this case, each and every domain needs to communicate with booking, because booking knows about all the book tickets, and so it tells the other domains which passengers are allowed to check in and which passengers are allowed to give you some luggage or to board the plane. But giving all of them direct access and full access to booking is not a good idea. Because in this case, a change within booking would influence all the other domains. You would be capable of breaking the whole system just by modifying booking. A better idea is what they are calling the shared kernel. The shared kernel is just a fancy DDD term for a bunch of shared libraries. But the thing is, as the shared kernel belongs everyone, at the end of the day it belongs no one. It is like cleaning a shared flat. I've always said, well, the person who thinks that this flat is dirty shall clean it. You can really imagine how this flat looked like. So we really want to prevent a situation like this, because this situation can also introduce breaking changes. A better idea would be to provide an API, a facade, which is exposing only selected stuff for other domains. Only a specific service or a tiny amount of services. And only this selected exported stuff needs to be backwards compatible. The rest can be changed, rewritten, thrown away as you like. With terms of domain-driven design, you would call this API open or host service, but as you know, the term service has a different meaning in Angular, and so I'm going with the term API. By the way, the term API better fits this tiny black box here. If you look into domain-driven design, you will find out about a bunch of different additional strategies for cross-domain communication. But for the time being, I will stick with those two. Now let's talk about how we can use this idea and implement this idea with an NX monorepo. If I need to implement this idea with an NX monorepo, and honestly I've done this with tons of customers in the last month, then the first step would be to subdivide the repository with directories. I would introduce one directory per subdomain, and then I'm also introducing another directory for the shared kernel. After that, I can fill those directories with libraries. And the smart people behind NX define several categories of libraries to make our life easier. One category here is what it's called the feature library. A feature library contains smart components. You know, a smart component is a component implementing a use case. It exactly knows what to do to bring the user one step further to a specific goal. And because it has been tailored for a specific use case, it's not that reusable. That's why we have utility libraries with dump components. They are reusable. Think about a date time picker. You can reuse it within each and every use case, dealing somehow with dates. The next kind of library is the domain library. It contains your domain model, your client-side data model, and also services operating upon it. And then we have the utility layer, having utility functions and services, for instance, for authentication or for logging. This brings a lot of order in your architecture. And this guarantees that people don't need to think much about where to find a specific piece, because they can orientate themselves by the vertical domains and by the horizontal layers. So finding out where to put something and finding out where to find something is quite easy. Also, you can introduce access restrictions. In this case, for instance, I defined that one layer is only allowed to access layers below. Here the feature layer is only allowed to access the UI layer, the domain layer and the utility layer. And the domain layer in turn is only allowed to talk with the utility layer. This prevents this intermingled situation where everything is highly coupled to everything else. Something strategic design tries to prevent. Also, it prevents cycles. As you know, cycles are nothing the TypeScript compiler is very happy about. This is one kind of access restriction, but there is a more important kind of access restriction, namely this one here. This kind of access restrictions tells you that one domain is only allowed to talk with its own libraries and with the shared libraries. So in this case, booking is allowed to use booking libraries and shared libraries. Boarding is allowed to use boarding libraries and also shared libraries. But booking is not allowed to directly communicate with boarding and vice versa. If you want to share something, you have to put it into your shared kernel. But as discussed before, the shared kernel is a bit problematic, and so it would be a nice idea to introduce this API we've talked about. An API exposing selected stuff from one domain for other domains. But only selected stuff, and only this stuff needs to be backwards compatible. Perhaps you're saying now, well, that looks nice. We have access restrictions. Everything is in place. Everything has its very own place in this matrix, but somehow it's overwhelming. Well, as a matter of fact, it's not that overwhelming at all. One reason is it is normally not a full rectangle. Normally, you only have feature libraries and domain libraries in the real domains, and you have reusable UI libraries and utility libraries in shared. Of course, there are exceptions to each and every rule. Let's say you have a UI library you only need for boarding, then you would put it into boarding to prevent this highly coupled situation. Also, generating libraries is a piece of cake. It is as difficult as generating an ng module. Only type in one command on command line and you are good. Okay, now let me show you everything in action. For this I have prepared an empty NX workspace, and instead of creating all my libraries by hand, I used this npm package. It's a very tiny npm package I've written. It contains some schematics to make it easy to create the structure we've seen before. If we look into our dependency graph, you will see two domains. Select all, you see two domains. The first domain is about booking. It has one feature and one domain library. The other domain is about luggage. It consists of two features and also one domain library. And as you see here, those domains are isolated from each other. It is forbidden to directly access the booking domain from within, let's say, luggage feature report loss. This is forbidden. If you try to do this, you would get immediately a linding error. If you want to reuse stuff from another domain, you have to go via a shared kernel or via an API. For instance, the booking domain could expose an API, which is in turn exposing selected stuff from its own booking domain. But directly accessing something in another domain is forbidden. Now let's have a look into this. If we look into this solution, let me close the folders. You see here a library folder. And this library folder contains one subfolder per domain. There is a booking folder, there is a luggage folder. And when we look into luggage, we see one feature library, another feature library, and our domain library. Everything within those libraries is just traditional Angular code. But thanks to having libraries, thanks to having domains, everything is organized nicely. And at first sight, by looking at the folder name or at the prefix feature, we know where this very library belongs to in our architecture matrix. Now let's try to do something ugly. Let's move to luggage feature report loss. And here let's try to import something from another domain. For instance, from our domain which is about booking. So as you see here, we immediately get a linting error. And this linting error is telling us that a project tagged with domain luggage can only depend on other projects within the luggage domain, and it can also depend upon libraries that are shared, that are part of the shared kernel. So our architectural matrix is enforced here. NX is doing this for us. And to make NX doing this, we just need to configure it. It is just a matter of 2 JSON files. The first JSON file is defining categories for your libraries. Here I've used the category domain luggage and domain shared. And the other file, which is the TS-lint JSON file, in future it will be the ES-lint JSON file, is defining that a library from this category is only allowed to use libraries associated with another category. So at the end of the day, it is really just a matter of configuring those access restrictions within your JSON files. Also, you get the same result when linting your application at command line. Let me zoom in a bit. Let's do an ng-lint, and here I want to lint luggage feature report loss. And yeah, we get the same linting error. I was never that happy about getting an error before, because this means that you can introduce this check into your build server, into your build scripts, making sure that no one is never ever breaking your architecture. So as you have seen here, this all is about fine-grained libraries. You're using libraries instead of ng modules, and so you can define fine-grained access restrictions. By the way, fine-grained libraries also allow for incremental recompilation and testing. That means only the changed libraries need to be retested and recompiled. The rest is taken out from a cache. It's another nice feature of NX. And saying this, you will really use libraries instead of ng modules, while each library gets one ng module generated. And that's really easy. You can go with ng generate library. You can also use my helper library with some helper schematics. By the way, there is another nice talk in this conference. It is done by my good old friend Yuri, and he exactly talks about this incremental compilation aspect of NX. Also, if you like this presentation, perhaps you also like my free ebook, you can download it here. And there is a final thought I want to give you, namely, domain thinking is also the key for micro frontends. Because what are micro frontends? Micro frontends are a tiny piece of a bigger software system, a tiny piece which is isolated from the other pieces to make it more maintainable. And the foundation for cutting something into pieces is, at the end of the day, domain thinking, domain modeling, strategic domain design. So let me sum everything up. What did we see today? We've seen that slicing a big application into subdomain is beneficial. You get more or less independent parts which can be evolved separately without destroying anything else. We've seen that using fine-grained libraries is nice in order to introduce access restrictions. You can really enforce them with linting when it comes to NX. And there is a last thing I really want you to remember. Please never ever forget it. If I forgot everything, please remember this one thing, namely, don't make your software architecture to be an incredible machine. It's a nice game, but it's not a good architecture. Here you find my coordinates. Meanwhile, I've uploaded all my material, my examples and my slides to my blog. And if you want, follow me on Twitter so that we can stay in contact. Thanks for having me. It was really a pleasure, and have a nice day. Have a nice conference.